July 17, 1944. The dense jungle canopy of Guam shudders as Captain Richard Whitmore crouches in a bomb crater, his SCR-300 radio strapped to his back like a lifeline to the heavens. 200 yards ahead, through the suffocating green maze of vegetation, 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the 29th Infantry Division are massing for a counterattack that could shatter the American beachhead. Whitmore adjusts the frequency dial with fingers still trembling from adrenaline and keys the microphone. His voice cuts through the static with coordinates that will summon something the enemy has never encountered before. 4 Corsair fighters banking overhead carry silver canisters filled with a substance that burns at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit and sticks to human skin like flaming glue. The Japanese infantry charging through that jungle are about to discover that modern warfare has rendered their bamboo spear charges and bushido courage tragically obsolete. This is the story of how a handful of men with radios changed the nature of infantry combat forever, and why the weapon they controlled became the most feared delivery system in the Pacific theater. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The origins of forward air control trace back not to military academies or strategic planning sessions, but to the desperate improvisations of the North African Desert Campaign. In 1942, British and American forces fighting Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps discovered a fundamental problem that would define combined arms warfare for generations. Aircraft could deliver devastating firepower, but pilots flying at 200 miles per hour at 15,000 feet couldn't distinguish friendly forces from enemy positions. The desert battles became chaotic affairs where close air support missions often struck the wrong targets, killing Allied soldiers and destroying friendly vehicles while enemy forces escaped unscathed. The solution emerged from necessity rather than doctrine. British officers began experimenting with what they called tentacles, radio-equipped vehicles that accompanied forward infantry units and communicated directly with aircraft overhead. These primitive forward air control posts proved their worth during the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, when coordinated airstrikes helped break through German defensive lines that had stalemated ground forces for months. American military observers studying these British innovations recognized both the potential and the limitations of the system. The radio equipment was cumbersome, the coordination procedures were ad hoc, and the training was minimal. But the fundamental concept was revolutionary. Infantry commanders could request airstrikes with the same immediacy they called for artillery support, transforming aircraft from strategic weapons into tactical instruments controlled at the company and battalion level. Lieutenant Colonel William Harris of the United States Army Air Forces became the unlikely architect of America's forward air control system. Harris had flown reconnaissance missions over France during World War I, navigating by compass and landmarks while artillery shells burst around his fragile biplane. That experience taught him something that peacetime military theorists consistently overlooked. The view from above and the reality on the ground existed in separate universes, and bridging that gap required more than radio technology. It required a new kind of soldier who could think simultaneously as an infantryman and an aviator. Harris spent the interwar years developing tactical aviation doctrine at Maxwell Field in Alabama, largely ignored by senior officers who believed strategic bombing would dominate future conflicts. He argued that the next war would be won by coordinated combined arms teams where infantry, armor, artillery, and aviation worked as integrated systems rather than separate services pursuing independent objectives. His ideas attracted little attention until German blitzkrieg tactics in Poland and France demonstrated exactly what he had been describing. Suddenly, the Army Air Forces needed his expertise desperately. In early 1943, Harris established the first formal forward air controller training program at Camp McCall in North Carolina. The students he recruited were unusual specimens for military aviators. Harris wanted pilots who had infantry experience, men who understood ground combat from the mud level rather than the abstractions of staff college lectures. He found them among National Guard officers, civilian pilots who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, and occasionally among bomber pilots who had washed out of heavy aircraft training but possessed the aggressive instincts Harris valued. The training regimen Harris developed at Camp McCall became the template for forward air control doctrine throughout the war. Students learned to read terrain from both ground and air perspectives, recognizing how landscape features that seemed insignificant at eye level became crucial reference points from altitude. They practiced radio procedures until they could transmit complex coordinate information while under simulated combat stress. They studied aircraft recognition until they could identify friendly and enemy planes from silhouette fragments glimpsed through jungle canopy or cloud cover. Most critically, Harris taught his students to think in 3 dimensions simultaneously. A forward air controller needed to track friendly unit positions, identify enemy concentrations, calculate attack vectors that would minimize friendly fire risk, and coordinate multiple aircraft conducting successive strikes. The mental demands were extraordinary, requiring spatial reasoning abilities that most people simply didn't possess. Harris estimated that only about 1 in 20 pilot candidates had the cognitive capacity to master forward air control techniques. The weapon these controllers would direct into combat was as revolutionary as the tactical system itself. Napalm began as a Harvard University chemistry project that had nothing to do with military applications. In 1942, Professor Louis Fieser was researching thickening agents for various industrial applications when military researchers approached him with an unusual problem. Standard incendiary bombs using thermite or phosphorus created intense but brief fires that armored vehicles and fortified positions could often survive. The military wanted something that burned longer, stuck to surfaces, and couldn't be extinguished with water or sand. Fieser's solution combined aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmidate, creating a gel that could be mixed with gasoline to produce a substance with properties unlike any previous incendiary material. The name napalm came from the chemical components, naphthenate and palmidate. When ignited, napalm burned at temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 10 minutes. More significantly, it adhered to whatever it touched, creating a clinging fire that was nearly impossible to remove or extinguish. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to military planners. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific had proven masters of defensive warfare, constructing bunkers and cave systems that resisted conventional artillery and bombing. American infantry advancing against these positions suffered horrific casualties, sometimes taking weeks to capture objectives that measured only hundreds of yards. Flamethrower teams could clear individual bunkers but operated at ranges where Japanese defenders could easily kill the operators. Artillery could destroy bunkers if direct hits were achieved, but the precision required made this wasteful and time-consuming. Napalm offered a solution that combined wide area coverage with sustained burning effects. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. A single 500-pound napalm bomb could blanket an area the size of a football field with burning gel that would continue killing for minutes after the initial explosion. Bunkers that could survive high explosive bombs became death traps when napalm flowed through ventilation openings and ignition ports. Cave systems that protected Japanese soldiers from artillery bombardment became ovens when napalm fires consumed the oxygen and produced toxic gases that penetrated deep underground. The moral and ethical implications of napalm warfare generated surprisingly little debate during World War II. American military and civilian leaders viewed the weapon as a means of reducing American casualties while accelerating victory against an enemy who refused to surrender under any circumstances. The horrific burns napalm inflicted were considered no worse than the effects of flamethrowers, white phosphorus, or high explosive fragmentation. In the context of total war against Imperial Japan, napalm was simply another tool for achieving military objectives at minimum cost to American lives. Production of napalm munitions began in late 1943 at several chemical plants across the United States. The Dow Chemical Company facility in Midland, Michigan became the primary manufacturer, producing thousands of tons of napalm gel monthly by mid-1944. The gel was shipped to forward bases throughout the Pacific, where ordnance crews mixed it with aviation gasoline and loaded the mixture into drop tanks that had been modified to rupture on impact and disperse the burning fuel across wide areas. The marriage of napalm weapons and forward air control created a tactical system unlike anything previously seen in military history. For the first time, infantry company commanders could request precision fire support from aircraft carrying weapons that could neutralize enemy positions conventional artillery couldn't reach. The forward air controller became the crucial link connecting these capabilities, translating ground combat requirements into aerial delivery instructions that put napalm exactly where it would produce maximum tactical effect. Training forward air controllers to coordinate napalm strikes required additional specialized instruction beyond the basic air control course. Controllers learned to calculate safe separation distances between friendly forces and napalm impact zones, accounting for wind conditions that could spread burning gel beyond intended target areas. They practiced marking techniques using colored smoke grenades and panels that would guide pilots to targets concealed by jungle vegetation. They studied the behavioral characteristics of napalm fires, learning how the burning gel would flow downhill, pool in depressions, and penetrate covered positions. The psychological preparation was perhaps more important than the technical training. Forward air controllers would be calling napalm strikes on enemy positions that might contain wounded soldiers, medical personnel, or even civilians caught in combat zones. The weapon's effects were uniquely horrific, inflicting burns that caused prolonged suffering even when victims survived the initial attack. Controllers needed to maintain professional detachment while directing strikes they knew would cause extraordinary human suffering. By early 1944, the forward air control system was ready for combat testing. The invasion of the Mariana Islands, scheduled for June, would provide the first opportunity to employ forward air controllers and napalm weapons in coordinated offensive operations. The Japanese garrisons on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had been reinforced and fortified throughout 1943, creating defensive networks that American planners knew would exact terrible costs from attacking infantry forces. Forward air controllers accompanying the assault waves would determine whether the new tactical system could deliver on its theoretical promise. Captain Richard Whitmore arrived on Guam as part of the initial assault wave on July 21, 1944. His background exemplified the unconventional path many forward air controllers followed into their specialized role. Whitmore had been a crop duster pilot in Nebraska before the war, flying ancient biplanes at treetop level while spraying pesticides on wheat fields. That experience gave him an intuitive understanding of low-altitude flight dynamics and terrain following that formal military training couldn't replicate. When Whitmore enlisted in the Army Air Forces after Pearl Harbor, his civilian flying experience qualified him for pilot training, but his academic background suggested other possibilities. Whitmore had studied civil engineering at the University of Nebraska before economic necessity forced him to abandon college for crop dusting work. That engineering education gave him mathematical and spatial reasoning abilities that caught Lieutenant Colonel Harris's attention when Whitmore's application reached the Forward Air Control Training Program. Whitmore graduated from Camp McCall in February 1944 and spent 4 months in Hawaii practicing coordination procedures with Marine Corps infantry units and Navy carrier aircraft pilots. The training emphasized realistic scenarios where communication equipment malfunctioned, weather-obscured targets, and friendly forces were dangerously close to strike zones. Whitmore learned that successful forward air control required improvisation and judgment as much as technical proficiency. The landing at Guam thrust Whitmore immediately into the chaotic reality of amphibious assault. Japanese artillery and mortar fire raked the beaches as Marines struggled to establish defensive perimeters against counterattacks that began before the sun had fully risen. Whitmore's radio equipment survived the landing intact, but the antenna was damaged by shrapnel, reducing his transmission range to barely 5 miles. The carrier aircraft he was supposed to coordinate with were orbiting 20 miles offshore, too distant for reliable communication with his weakened radio. Whitmore spent his first 2 hours on Guam trying desperately to jerry-rig a functional antenna using wire scavenged from destroyed equipment and improvised supports fashioned from bamboo poles. The technical challenge consumed his attention while Marines around him fought off Japanese infiltrators who had survived the preliminary bombardment.
By the time Whitmore restored radio contact with the orbiting aircraft, the beachhead situation had deteriorated significantly. Japanese forces were massing in the jungle beyond the American perimeter, preparing counterattacks that could potentially drive the invasion force back into the ocean. The moment that would validate years of forward air control development came at approximately 1400 hours on July 21st, when a Marine lieutenant colonel named James Rothwell found Whitmore crouched behind a disabled tank trying to raise the strike aircraft on his radio. Rothwell commanded the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, and his reconnaissance patrols had identified a Japanese assembly area approximately 1,000 yards inland where enemy forces were gathering for a twilight counterattack. Artillery couldn't reach the position because the jungle canopy prevented aerial observation for fire adjustment. Infantry assault would require advancing through a ravine where Japanese machine guns commanded every approach. Rothwell asked Whitmore a simple question. Could he put napalm on that assembly area before sunset? Whitmore studied his maps, calculated coordinates, and estimated that 4 Corsairs carrying napalm could saturate the target zone if they approached from the northwest, where terrain features would guide them to the objective. Rothwell approved the strike, and Whitmore keyed his microphone to begin the coordination sequence that would demonstrate whether forward air control theory could survive contact with combat reality. The next 15 minutes were among the most intense of Whitmore's life. He transmitted coordinate information to the flight leader orbiting offshore, describing terrain features and providing wind estimates based on smoke drift patterns he observed. The pilot acknowledged the coordinates but requested visual confirmation before commencing the attack run. Whitmore grabbed a case of colored smoke grenades and sprinted 300 yards forward to a shell crater on the perimeter edge where he had clear sight lines toward the target area. Japanese snipers hidden in the surrounding jungle immediately opened fire when Whitmore reached the crater.
Bullets cracked past his head as he pulled the pin on a red smoke grenade and hurled it toward the Japanese assembly area. The grenade landed short, producing a crimson cloud that drifted northeast in the afternoon breeze. Whitmore corrected his aim and threw a second grenade that landed within 50 yards of his intended impact point. The red smoke billowed up through the jungle canopy, creating a marker visible from altitude. Whitmore pressed himself flat in the crater as Japanese fire intensified, bullets kicking up dirt around the rim and ricocheting off rocks with angry whines. He keyed the radio microphone and transmitted the critical information. Red smoke marks the target. Friendlies are 300 yards southeast. Attack axis northwest to southeast. Cleared hot for napalm delivery. The Corsair flight leader acknowledged, and Whitmore heard the distinctive sound of the gull-winged fighters diving from altitude. He risked lifting his head above the crater rim to watch what happened next. 4 Corsairs came screaming down through the humid Pacific air in a string formation, each aircraft offset slightly from the one ahead. The lead Corsair released its napalm tanks at approximately 500 feet altitude directly above the red smoke marker. The tanks tumbled through the air for 2 seconds before impacting in the jungle canopy and exploding in a massive fireball that created an instant wall of flame rising 200 feet into the sky. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Corsairs released their napalm in precise intervals, creating overlapping fire zones that transformed the Japanese assembly area into an inferno. Whitmore watched burning gel cascading through the jungle vegetation like a flaming waterfall, igniting everything combustible and flowing into depressions where Japanese soldiers had been sheltering. The heat was intense enough that Whitmore felt it on his face from 300 yards away. Secondary explosions erupted as ammunition stores and fuel dumps caught fire, sending columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. The napalm burned for 7 minutes, creating temperatures that made the jungle itself ignite spontaneously. Trees exploded from internal steam pressure. The ground vegetation was incinerated down to bare earth. Everything within the 200-yard impact zone was either consumed by fire or killed by heat and oxygen depletion. When the flames finally subsided, the Japanese assembly area had been transformed into a smoking wasteland where nothing remained alive. Whitmore scrambled back to the battalion command post where Colonel Rothwell was watching the smoke column with grim satisfaction. Reconnaissance patrols advancing into the impact zone 2 hours later reported finding approximately 400 Japanese dead, along with destroyed equipment, weapon stockpiles, and communication gear. The counterattack that would have struck the marine perimeter at twilight had been eliminated completely by 4 Corsairs and a forward air controller who had learned his trade spraying wheat fields in Nebraska. Word of Whitmore's successful strike spread rapidly through the beachhead. By evening, every battalion commander wanted forward air controllers attached to their units. The demand exceeded supply dramatically. Only 30 forward air controllers had accompanied the initial assault waves, and they were suddenly the most requested asset in the entire invasion force. Whitmore conducted 3 more strikes before darkness ended flight operations, each time putting napalm precisely where ground commanders needed it most. The Guam campaign would continue for another 2 weeks, but the pattern established on that first day repeated consistently. Forward air controllers directed hundreds of napalm strikes against Japanese positions, bunkers, troop concentrations, and supply areas. The weapon proved devastatingly effective against targets that conventional artillery struggled to neutralize. Japanese forces attempting to maneuver in daylight were incinerated by napalm delivered within minutes of their detection. Defensive positions that would have required days of infantry combat to reduce were eliminated by single airstrikes lasting seconds. The tactical revolution Whitmore and his fellow controllers enabled changed the fundamental calculus of Pacific warfare. American infantry no longer needed to assault heavily defended positions with rifles and grenades. They could call down fire from the sky that would clear obstacles before ground forces advanced. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was immense. Soldiers who could endure artillery bombardment and survive aerial bombing discovered that napalm eliminated any possibility of survival in fixed defensive positions. The weapon's effects were simply too comprehensive and too sustained for any protective measures to matter. The success at Guam attracted immediate attention from theater commanders who recognized they had stumbled upon something that transcended standard tactical innovation. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Fleet operations, personally reviewed after-action reports describing how forward air controllers had eliminated Japanese defensive positions that would have cost hundreds of American casualties to capture through conventional infantry assault. Nimitz ordered an immediate expansion of the forward air controller program and accelerated production of napalm munitions across all Pacific bases. What made the system so revolutionary wasn't just the destructive power of napalm itself, but the speed and precision with which forward air controllers could deliver that power exactly where ground commanders needed it most. Traditional close air support required elaborate pre-planning, with targets identified hours or days in advance and strike packages coordinated through multiple command echelons. Forward air controllers compressed that timeline to minutes. A company commander encountering unexpected resistance could have napalm strikes inbound within 15 minutes of requesting support. The implications rippled through American tactical doctrine with surprising speed. Infantry units began planning operations around the assumption of immediate air support, rather than treating aviation as an occasional supplement to ground firepower. Battalion commanders positioned forward air controllers at critical junctures where their ability to summon napalm strikes would provide maximum tactical flexibility. The radio-equipped controllers became as essential to infantry operations as machine gun sections or mortar teams. Lieutenant Marcus Hendricks discovered the full potential of this new capability during the Battle for Peleliu in September 1944. Hendricks had been a commercial radio operator in Seattle before the war, spending his nights monitoring ship-to-shore communications from a small station overlooking Puget Sound.
That background gave him technical expertise with radio equipment that most pilots lacked, making him a natural candidate for forward air controller training despite his limited flying experience. Peleliu presented tactical challenges unlike anything American forces had encountered previously in the Pacific campaign. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had abandoned the suicidal beach defense tactics that had failed at Tarawa and Saipan. Instead, Nakagawa positioned his forces in a coral ridge system honeycombed with caves and tunnels that connected hundreds of mutually supporting defensive positions. The terrain was so broken and the defensive work so extensive that conventional artillery could barely scratch the Japanese fortifications. Hendricks came ashore with the 1st Marine Division on September 15th, establishing his forward air control post in a shell crater approximately 400 yards inland from the beach. The initial landing had gone smoothly, with Japanese forces offering only token resistance as Marines pushed rapidly through the coastal terrain. That changed abruptly when lead elements reached the base of Umurbrogel Mountain, a coral ridge complex that rose 300 feet above the surrounding landscape. Japanese fire erupted from dozens of concealed positions as Marines attempted to advance up the ridge slopes. Machine guns firing from cave mouths swept the approaches with interlocking fire that made movement suicidal. Mortars registered on every possible avenue of advance dropped shells with uncanny accuracy on any Marine who exposed himself. Artillery spotters hidden in observation posts on the ridge crest called down fire from howitzers positioned in reverse slope positions that American counter-battery fire couldn't reach. The 1st Marines suffered over 200 casualties in the first hour of fighting around Umurbrogel without gaining more than 50 yards of ground. Battalion commanders quickly recognized that conventional infantry tactics would require weeks to capture the ridge at costs that would effectively destroy their units. Hendricks received urgent requests for air support from 3 different battalion commanders simultaneously, each one describing targets that required immediate attention. The problem was that the targets weren't visible from the air. Japanese positions were concealed in caves and crevices, invisible from altitude. The coral terrain was so chaotic that identifying specific features from overhead was nearly impossible. Hendricks realized he needed to get closer to the ridge to effectively direct strikes against the hidden defensive positions. He gathered his radio equipment and recruited 2 Marine riflemen to provide security, then set out across 500 yards of open ground swept by Japanese fire. The movement was terrifying. Japanese snipers tracked any Marine who left cover, and machine gun fire raked the coral formations with methodical precision. Hendricks and his 2 escorts moved in short rushes, sprinting between shell craters and coral outcroppings while bullets cracked past their heads. One of the Marines took a round through his shoulder during the movement, forcing Hendricks to drag the wounded man into cover and apply a field dressing before continuing forward. Hendricks reached a position approximately 200 yards from the ridge base, where he had clear observation of several cave mouths from which Japanese fire originated. He set up his radio equipment behind a coral formation and established contact with a flight of 4 Corsairs orbiting 15 miles offshore, carrying napalm and high-explosive ordnance. The challenge was marking targets that were essentially invisible until Japanese troops fired from them. The solution Hendricks devised became standard procedure for forward air controllers throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. He positioned himself where he could observe the ridge face while remaining concealed from Japanese observers. When Japanese machine guns opened fire from a cave position, Hendricks would immediately note the location and transmit coordinates to the orbiting aircraft. The Corsairs would dive on the target within seconds, delivering napalm into the cave mouth before Japanese gunners could displace to alternate positions. The technique required extraordinary courage and even more extraordinary timing. Hendricks needed to remain exposed to Japanese fire long enough to pinpoint their positions, then direct aircraft onto targets while those same Japanese soldiers were actively trying to kill him. The margin for error was non-existent. Coordinates off by even 50 yards could result in napalm strikes hitting Marine positions instead of enemy caves. Over the next 6 hours, Hendricks directed 17 separate napalm strikes against Japanese positions on Umurbrogel Ridge. Each strike followed the same pattern. Japanese weapons would fire from a concealed position. Hendricks would mark the location and transmit coordinates to the orbiting aircraft. The Corsairs would dive on the target within seconds, delivering napalm into the cave mouth before Japanese gunners could displace to alternate positions. The psychological impact on surviving defenders was devastating. By nightfall, the Marines had advanced 800 yards up the ridge slopes, progress that would have been impossible without the napalm strikes Hendricks coordinated. The cost was still significant, with over 50 Marines killed and 200 wounded, but battalion commanders recognized that conventional tactics would produce casualties 5 times higher for the same territorial gain. Hendricks himself survived the day unscathed, despite spending 6 hours within easy rifle range of Japanese positions. The Peleliu campaign continued for another 2 months, becoming one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Forward air controllers like Hendricks worked daily to reduce Japanese positions that couldn't be reached by artillery or naval gunfire. The napalm strikes became the primary method for neutralizing cave defenses, with hundreds of sorties flown to support the grinding advance through the coral ridges. Japanese defenders adapted their tactics in response to the napalm threat, but their options were severely limited. Abandoning cave positions meant exposure to artillery and machine gun fire in terrain that offered no natural cover. Remaining in caves meant vulnerability to napalm strikes that could transform any enclosed space into a crematorium within seconds. Japanese commanders tried dispersing their forces to reduce the effectiveness of individual strikes, but that made coordinated defense impossible and allowed Marines to penetrate defensive lines more easily. The tactical stalemate that emerged revealed both the power and the limitations of forward air control with napalm weapons.
American forces could eliminate any Japanese position they could locate and mark for airstrikes. However, the Japanese defensive network on Peleliu was so extensive that identifying and striking every position required months of methodical operations. The battle demonstrated that napalm was extraordinarily effective, but not miraculous. Victory still required infantry to occupy ground and eliminate defenders who refused to surrender under any circumstances. While the fighting on Peleliu ground forward, other forward air controllers were discovering additional applications for their unique capabilities in different tactical situations. Captain James Thornton encountered one such situation during operations on Leyte in the Philippines during October 1944. Thornton had been a county surveyor in Montana before the war, experience that gave him exceptional map-reading skills and an intuitive understanding of terrain analysis. The Leyte campaign differed from previous Pacific operations because Japanese forces possessed substantial ground reinforcements they could commit to the battle. Unlike isolated island garrisons, Japanese units on Leyte could be reinforced from other Philippine islands and even from the Asian mainland. This meant American forces faced not just entrenched defenders, but mobile formations conducting counterattacks and offensive operations. On October 28th, intelligence reports indicated that Japanese forces were massing approximately 3,000 troops in a valley complex 12 miles west of the American beachhead. The Japanese plan appeared to be a coordinated assault designed to penetrate American lines and recapture the airfields that were critical to maintaining air superiority over the Philippines. Ground reconnaissance couldn't reach the assembly area without alerting Japanese forces, and traditional aerial reconnaissance provided insufficient detail about troop concentrations hidden beneath jungle canopy. Thornton received orders to conduct an aerial reconnaissance mission in a 2-seat observation aircraft to locate and mark the Japanese assembly area for a massive napalm strike. The mission was extraordinarily dangerous because Japanese anti-aircraft defenses in the area included numerous light and medium-caliber weapons positioned specifically to engage low-flying aircraft. Previous reconnaissance flights had been driven off by intense ground fire without obtaining useful intelligence. Thornton took off at dawn in an L-5 Sentinel observation plane piloted by a young Army aviator named Robert Chen. The L-5 was essentially a militarized version of a civilian light aircraft constructed largely of fabric and plywood with minimal armor protection. Its primary advantages were slow speed that allowed detailed observation and maneuverability that could help evade ground fire. Its disadvantage was that any substantial hit would likely prove fatal to the crew. Chen flew the L-5 at treetop level toward the target valley, using terrain features to mask their approach from Japanese observers. The flight took 40 minutes of nerve-wracking navigation through mountain passes where turbulence tossed the light aircraft like a leaf in a storm. Thornton spent the flight studying his maps and preparing to identify landmarks that would allow precise coordinate determination once they reached the target area. The valley appeared suddenly as Chen guided the L-5 through a narrow pass and descended into the basin where Japanese forces were assembling. Thornton immediately saw why conventional reconnaissance had failed to locate the enemy concentration. Japanese commanders had positioned their troops beneath the heaviest jungle canopy where aerial observation was nearly impossible. Only smoke from cooking fires revealed that approximately 3,000 soldiers were hidden in the vegetation below. Japanese anti-aircraft fire erupted within seconds of the L-5 entering the valley. Tracers arced upward from multiple positions as machine gunners tracked the slow-moving observation plane. Chen threw the L-5 into violent evasive maneuvers, banking and diving erratically, while Thornton tried desperately to mark coordinates on his map. Bullets punched through the fabric wings and fuselage, creating a sound like hailstones hitting a tin roof. Thornton had approximately 90 seconds to gather the information needed to direct the napalm strike before Japanese fire would inevitably shoot them down. He identified 3 key terrain features: a distinctive rock formation at the valley's north end, a stream junction at the center, and a burned area at the south end. Using these reference points, he estimated coordinates for the Japanese assembly area and scribbled them in his notebook while Chen desperately maneuvered to avoid the intensifying anti-aircraft fire. A burst of machine gun fire shattered the L-5's instrument panel, sending fragments of glass and metal through the cockpit. Chen took shrapnel in his left arm and shoulder, but maintained control of the aircraft as he dove toward the valley floor to escape the fire. The L-5 cleared the valley rim with Japanese tracers still pursuing it, emerging into safer airspace with dozens of bullet holes perforating the airframe and fuel leaking from a punctured tank. Chen managed to nurse the damaged aircraft back to base, where he crash-landed on a dirt strip with the engine coughing its final revolutions. Thornton emerged from the wreckage with his notebook intact and coordinates that would guide the largest napalm strike yet attempted in the Pacific Theater. Within 2 hours, 24 Corsairs and Hellcat fighters loaded with napalm were airborne and headed to the coordinates Thornton had risked his life to obtain. The strike force arrived over the target valley at noon, catching Japanese forces completely by surprise as they prepared for their evening assault. The aircraft attacked in waves, each successive element adding to the growing inferno that consumed the jungle canopy. 72 napalm canisters transformed the entire valley floor into a sea of flames that burned for over an hour. The heat was so intense that it created its own weather system, generating updrafts that made subsequent attack runs hazardous. Ground reconnaissance teams entering the valley 3 days later found evidence of complete devastation. Thousands of Japanese soldiers had been incinerated or killed by heat and oxygen depletion. Equipment, weapons, ammunition, and supplies were destroyed or rendered unusable. The counterattack that could have seriously threatened American positions never materialized because the forces designated to conduct it had ceased to exist as combat-effective units. The Leyte Valley strike demonstrated that forward air controllers could do more than provide tactical support to engaged infantry units. They could conduct strategic reconnaissance and direct devastating attacks against enemy forces before those forces could threaten American positions. This represented a fundamental shift in how air power could influence ground campaigns. Aircraft were no longer relegated to supporting ground operations. They could shape the battlefield by eliminating enemy capabilities before those capabilities could be brought to bear. Japanese military analysts studying American tactical methods were deeply troubled by these developments. Captured documents revealed their growing understanding that conventional defensive tactics were becoming obsolete in the face of coordinated air-ground operations. A Japanese staff analysis from late 1944 acknowledged that American forward air controllers provided company and battalion commanders with firepower comparable to division-level artillery assets, fundamentally altering the tactical balance. Japanese forces attempted various countermeasures to reduce their vulnerability to napalm strikes. Some units tried camouflaging positions more effectively, but the heat signatures from cooking fires and vehicle engines betrayed their locations to aerial observers. Other units attempted dispersing to reduce strike effectiveness, but that made coordinated defensive operations impossible. Some Japanese commanders tried conducting operations exclusively at night, when American air support was limited, but that surrendered daylight hours to American forces, who used the time to advance and consolidate positions. The most desperate Japanese countermeasure involved attempting to shoot down forward air controllers before they could direct strikes. Japanese snipers and infiltration teams specifically targeted radio-equipped soldiers, recognizing that eliminating the controllers would blind American air support capabilities. This made forward air control one of the most dangerous specialties in the Pacific War, with casualty rates exceeding 30% among controllers who served in frontline positions. Lieutenant David Kozlowski discovered exactly how dangerous the role could be during operations on Iwo Jima in February 1945. Kozlowski had been a high school mathematics teacher in Pennsylvania before the war, a background that gave him the analytical abilities forward air controllers needed, but no particular preparation for the violence he would experience. Iwo Jima represented the ultimate test of forward air control doctrine, because the entire island was essentially one massive fortified position bristling with Japanese defensive works. Japanese commander Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months transforming Iwo Jima into the most heavily defended piece of real estate in military history. Over 20,000 Japanese troops occupied 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, 16 miles of underground passages, and hundreds of reinforced bunkers. Every square yard of the island was covered by pre-registered artillery and mortar fire. Kuribayashi had studied American tactics extensively and specifically planned defenses to neutralize the advantages American forces normally enjoyed. Kozlowski came ashore on February 19th with the fourth wave of Marines assaulting the volcanic black sand beaches. Japanese fire was relatively light during the landing, giving Kozlowski false hope that the preliminary bombardment had suppressed enemy defenses. That illusion shattered within minutes as Marines pushed inland and Kuribayashi's forces opened fire from positions that had survived days of naval and aerial bombardment. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as Marines discovered that conventional tactics were suicidal against Iwo Jima's defenses. Bunkers firing from reverse-slope positions couldn't be reached by naval gunfire. Artillery positions hidden in caves were impervious to counter-battery fire. Infantry advancing across open terrain was cut down by machine guns firing from concealed pillboxes invisible until they opened fire. Kozlowski established his forward air control post in a shell crater approximately 200 yards inland from the beach, one of the few positions offering any protection from the murderous Japanese fire sweeping the volcanic terrain. He immediately began coordinating napalm strikes against targets identified by desperate company commanders whose units were pinned down and taking casualties faster than replacements could be brought forward. The volcanic terrain created unique challenges for directing airstrikes. The black sand absorbed radar energy, making electronic targeting unreliable. The sulfurous haze rising from volcanic vents obscured visual observation. The complete absence of vegetation meant there were no landmarks to reference when transmitting coordinates. Kozlowski found himself directing strikes using compass bearings and range estimates from his own position, a technique requiring mathematical calculations performed under extreme stress while Japanese fire sought to kill him. Over the next 8 days, Kozlowski directed 43 separate napalm strikes against Japanese positions across southern Iwo Jima. Each strike required exposing himself to enemy observation to mark targets with smoke grenades or direct pilots onto objectives using verbal descriptions. Japanese snipers wounded Kozlowski twice, minor hits that didn't disable him but reminded him constantly that enemy soldiers were specifically targeting him because of his radio equipment. The most critical strike Kozlowski coordinated came on February 27th when a Japanese counterattack threatened to penetrate Marine lines near the base of Mount Suribachi.
Approximately 500 Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnel entrances and charged Marine positions in a desperate attempt to recapture lost ground. The attack achieved tactical surprise, overrunning several forward positions before Marine commanders could organize effective resistance. Kozlowski was positioned less than 300 yards from the breakthrough point when he received urgent requests for immediate air support. 6 Corsairs loaded with napalm were orbiting overhead awaiting tasking, but the rapidly changing tactical situation made identifying safe strike coordinates nearly impossible. Japanese and American forces were intermingled in close combat, where any airstrike risked killing Marines along with enemy soldiers. Kozlowski made the decision that would earn him a Silver Star and haunt his nightmares for decades afterward. He transmitted coordinates that placed the napalm strike danger close to Marine positions, within 100 yards of friendly forces fighting desperately to contain the Japanese breakthrough. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any deviation in the strike delivery would result in American casualties from friendly fire. The lead Corsair pilot acknowledged the coordinates and questioned whether Kozlowski understood how close the strike would come to friendly positions. Kozlowski confirmed he understood and that the strike was necessary to prevent the Japanese counterattack from collapsing the Marine defensive line. The pilot cleared his approach and dove toward the target with 3 other Corsairs following in trail. The napalm canisters impacted exactly where Kozlowski intended, creating a wall of flame between the Japanese attackers and Marine positions. The burning gel cascaded over charging Japanese soldiers, engulfing them in fires that stopped the counterattack instantly. Marines who had been seconds away from being overrun watched as enemy soldiers collapsed within 50 yards of their positions, their uniforms and equipment burning as napalm consumed everything combustible. The strike killed over 300 Japanese soldiers and completely broke the momentum of the counterattack. It also killed 4 Marines who were too close to the impact zone when the napalm detonated. Kozlowski listened to casualty reports on his radio and understood he had made a decision that saved hundreds of American lives while directly causing 4 deaths. The mathematics were straightforward, but the moral weight was crushing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.